Under the sumptuous dome of Les Invalides in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte's tomb. 200 years after his death, the French president led commemorations for one of France's most famous leaders.
For more than 200 years, the world believed it knew exactly where Napoleon Bonaparte rested. Millions have visited his tomb without ever questioning what lay beneath the stone. But when it was finally opened, the discovery left historians stunned and sparked a mystery that refuses to die. What was found inside challenged long-held beliefs and made people wonder if one of history's greatest secrets had been hidden in plain sight all along. The red sarcophagus and the mystery that refuses to fade. Today, if you walk through the crypt at Les Invalides in Paris, you will see the grand red porphyry sarcophagus that holds Napoleon. Crowds come every year to stand before it and feel the weight of that name. What most people do not realize is that no one has looked inside the nested coffins since 1840. The last time the body was seen was on a distant island when a delegation opened the original grave. In 2021, exactly 200 years after Napoleon's death, a new wave of medical experts revisited one of history's most debated cases. They carefully reviewed the original autopsy records from 1821, along with later scientific studies of preserved hair samples, hoping modern analysis might reveal something earlier generations had missed. Instead, they reached the same conclusion as the doctors who examined him on St. Helena. Napoleon most likely died from advanced stomach disease, with internal bleeding ultimately causing his death. The findings reinforced the official historical account rather than overturning it. Even so, the French authorities made no attempt to reopen Napoleon's sarcophagus. They have continued to keep it sealed, arguing that the tomb is both a national monument and the final resting place of one of France's most important historical figures. Officials have also recognized that any new examination could reignite old conspiracy theories, challenge centuries of public belief, or risk damaging the carefully preserved remains. Because of that decision, the remarkable account from 1840, when Napoleon's body was exhumed before its return to France, remains the only direct eyewitness description of what was actually found inside the tomb after nearly 20 years underground. The fact that the description did not match what most people expected is what keeps the story alive in conversations and books right up to now. When you stand in front of the sarcophagus, you can sense that the stone is protecting more than bones. It is protecting a moment that still raises quiet questions about what really happens when time and careful sealing come together. The only way to understand why that account from 1840 still carries weight is to go back to the illness and death that put Napoleon in that grave in the first place. The emperor's final breath on a guarded island. By the spring of 1821, Napoleon had spent nearly 6 years as a prisoner on the island of St. Helena. The British had chosen the place because its isolation and strong defenses made any escape almost impossible. His health had been declining for months, with sharp pains in the stomach, vomiting that left him exhausted, and a steady loss of strength that turned the man who had once commanded armies into someone who spent most days in his room. On the 5th of May, he died at Longwood House. The small group of companions who had stayed with him through exile, including his valet, Louis Marchand, were there at the end. The next day, Dr. Francesco Antomarchi performed the post-mortem in front of several British medical officers and French witnesses who had shared the exile. The stomach showed a large area of disease that had eaten through the wall in places and caused heavy bleeding inside. There were adhesions to the liver and other changes that pointed to a condition that had been building for some time rather than a sudden event. The doctors present discussed details such as the size of the liver, but they agreed on the main finding in the stomach. After the examination, the body was washed and prepared by Marchand and the other servants who had served Napoleon in life. They dressed him in his uniform and placed his heart and stomach in separate containers as he had wished. Because full embalming was not possible on the island, they used a series of nested coffins instead. An inner tin lining went around the body, then a mahogany coffin, then a lead coffin that was soldered shut to keep air and moisture out, and finally, an outer mahogany coffin. The lead layer was the important one. It created a barrier that later proved more effective than anyone at the time could have known. The burial took place in a quiet valley on the island with a masonry vault and stone slabs on top. The Bourbon government in France at the time wanted the grave to stay simple and far away so it would not become a place of pilgrimage or political trouble. They had no interest in turning the dead emperor into a symbol that could challenge their restored rule. The men who lowered the coffins into the ground believed they were closing the chapter for good. Yet even the strongest seals cannot hold forever when politics in another country decides the grave must be opened again. A king reaches for a dead emperor's power. By 1840, the political situation in France had shifted once more. The Bourbon kings had fallen in the Revolution of 1830, and Louis Philippe now ruled as head of the July monarchy. His position was never entirely secure. He faced pressure from Republicans who wanted more change from those who still supported the old royal line, and from Bonapartists who looked back to the glory of the empire. Prime Minister Adolphe Thiers saw a chance to strengthen the king by bringing Napoleon back to France in a public ceremony. It would let Louis Philippe connect himself to national pride and perhaps draw some of the Bonapartist energy toward the throne instead of against it. The British government agreed to the request. Relations between the two countries were tense over other matters at the time, and allowing the transfer seemed like a way to ease things. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, gave the approval, and the French ambassador in London helped arrange the details. A frigate named Belle Poule was prepared for the voyage. It was painted black as a sign of mourning and placed under the command of Prince de Joinville, who was one of Louis Philippe's sons and a serving naval officer. On board were several men who had known Napoleon during his exile. General Henri Gatien Bertrand had been at the deathbed and had arranged the hand position when the body was placed in the coffin. General Gaspard Gourgaud had also been part of the inner circle. Louis Marchand the valet was there along with other former servants and the son of another companion, Count Emmanuel de Las Cases. Dr. Remy Julien Guillard, the ship's surgeon, would be the one to examine the body when the grave was opened. The presence of these men was deliberate. Their memories and emotions would give the event a sense of authenticity that a purely official group could not provide. The ship sailed from Toulon in July of 1840 and made its way across the Atlantic with stops along the route. The men on board carried both the weight of their old loyalty and the knowledge that they were part of a political plan larger than any one of them. As the Belle Poule neared St. Helena, the tension among them grew because they knew they would soon see what time had done to the man they had followed. The night the layers came away. The Belle Poule reached St. Helena in early October of 1840. On the 15th of that month, the French and British commissioners gathered at the gravesite in the valley. Local officials and some who had been present at the original burial also attended. Work started before dawn under torchlight. The stone slabs were lifted and the earth was dug away until the outer mahogany coffin came into view. It was lifted out and the process of opening the layers began. First, the outer wood was removed, then the lead coffin was exposed. The same plumber who had soldered it shut in 1821 was there to cut the seal again. Inside that lay another mahogany coffin and then the tin lining. Each step took time and care because the men wanted to avoid any damage. A quiet sense of anticipation mixed with unease ran through the group as the barriers came away one after another. They had no idea what they would find after 19 years. Some expected almost nothing left. Others hoped for at least enough to identify the remains clearly. When the final tin layer was opened, a white wadded satin padding that had lined the innermost coffin had come loose and settled over the body like a covering. Dr. Guillard was the one who reached in. He lifted one end of the padding and rolled it slowly back from the feet toward the head so that the form beneath could be seen. The torchlight showed the body still in the position it had been placed in at the burial. The head was slightly raised on a cushion, the left arm and hand rested on the left thigh, and the legs were lightly bent. The face was there in front of them, whole enough to be recognized at once by the men who had known Napoleon in life. The moment stretched as everyone took in what they were seeing. Dr. Guillard kept his examination short, only about 2 minutes, because he wanted to limit exposure to the air. Then he called for the coffins to be closed again. The men worked quickly to reseal everything and prepare the remains for the journey back to France. What they had witnessed in those brief minutes would travel with them across the ocean and shape how the return was remembered, what the torchlight revealed. Dr. Guillard later wrote a detailed account of what he saw in those 2 minutes. The face had not collapsed in the way most people would expect after so long. The high forehead and the shape of the skull were still clear under the skin, which had taken on a yellowish tone but remained firm and attached. The eyelids were closed and most of the eyelashes were still there. The eyes themselves had kept their form, though they had lost some volume. The nose was largely intact except for slight changes on the sides. The cheeks looked full and felt soft when touched. There was a bluish tint on the chin from beard growth that had continued after death. The mouth was slightly open, showing a few teeth. The hands were in good condition, with the fingers long and the nails still attached, and longer than they had been at burial because of the dry conditions inside the coffin. The uniform was recognizable as the green one Napoleon had worn with the red Legion of Honor ribbon across the chest. Other medals were present, though some had tarnished. The hat lay on the thighs. The boots had split at the seams enough to show the toes. Every object placed in the coffin in 1821 was still in its original spot. General Bertrand noticed at once that the left hand was in the exact position he had arranged it when he last touched Napoleon before the burial. Louis Marchand, who had dressed the living man many times, stood among those who recognized the features immediately. Several of the old companions wept openly at the sight. Dr. Guillard tried to stay measured in his notes, but even he recorded that the state of preservation was better than he had expected, given the circumstances of the autopsy and burial. The lead coffin had kept air and moisture from reaching the body in any significant amount. The cotton padding had absorbed what little humidity was present, and the solid masonry of the vault had prevented water from seeping in. Over time, the body fats had changed in a way that helped hold the form together, rather than letting everything break down. The men closed the coffins again as soon as the examination was done because they understood that further exposure could change what they had found. The image of the body in that position with the face still recognizable stayed with them as they carried the remains to the Belle Poule and began the voyage home. It was not the dramatic ruin or the perfect preservation that some later stories would claim, but it was enough to make everyone present feel the weight of the moment they had shared. Questions that rose from the grave. Once the coffins were resealed, the remains were placed in new containers suitable for the sea journey and loaded onto the Belle Poule. The ship left St. Helena a few days later and reached Cherbourg at the end of November in 1840. From there, the procession moved up the Seine toward Paris. Along the way, news of what had been found spread and excitement grew. In Paris, on the 15th of December, the coffin passed under the Arc de Triomphe, which Napoleon himself had ordered built and continued to Les Invalides, where King Louis Philippe received it in a large public ceremony. The event was meant to bring the country together, but it also gave new life to the story of the preserved body. Almost at once, questions began to appear. Some wondered whether the British might have replaced the remains at some point during the years of oversight on the island. Others later pointed to arsenic found in hair samples and asked whether poisoning had played a role in the death. Studies done in later decades on haircut before Napoleon even arrived on St. Helena showed similar levels of arsenic. The amounts matched what appeared in samples from his earlier time on Elba, and even in hair from Josephine and his son. This suggested the arsenic came from common sources of the period, such as hair treatments or environmental exposure, rather than a deliberate plot on the island. In 2021, a group of pathologists reviewed the original autopsy records again and confirmed that the stomach disease and bleeding described in 1821 were the cause of death. The body swap theories did not hold up against the details that matched across both the burial and the exhumation. Bertrand's memory of the hand position, the presence of the same servants at both events, and the consistent descriptions of the uniform and objects in the coffin all pointed to the same remains. French authorities have never allowed a new opening of the sarcophagus. Modern tools could answer some questions, but the risk to the remains and to the national story built around them has always been judged too great. The sealed tomb keeps the account from 1840 as the final direct record, and that record continues to draw attention because it does not fit the simple story of complete decay that most people expect after so many years. When you read the old reports, you can see how the moment on the island created a tension between what science can explain and what the emotional reaction of the witnesses made people want to believe. The return that changed how France remembered him. The voyage back from St. Helena took several weeks, and the arrival in Paris on the 15th of December 1840 turned into one of the largest public events of the century. The coffin traveled under the Arc de Triomphe while crowds lined the streets and veterans of the old army stood in tears. Church bells rang and the procession moved slowly to Les Invalides, where the king took part in the reception. At first, the remains were placed in a temporary chapel inside the complex. Later, under Napoleon III, a permanent tomb was built. In 1861, the nested coffins were moved into the red porphyry sarcophagus designed by the architect Visconti and placed in the crypt beneath the dome. The political plan of Louis Philippe had worked in one sense by linking his rule to the memory of national glory. In another sense, it strengthened the Napoleonic legend more than the July monarchy itself. The image of the body that had looked recognizable after 19 years gave people a picture of endurance that fit the story they wanted to tell about their former emperor. It turned a fallen leader into something closer to a lasting symbol whose presence could not be fully erased by time or defeat. Today, the sarcophagus remains one of the most visited sites in Paris. Visitors come to stand before the stone and feel connected to a figure who shaped Europe. What they are really standing before is the result of that night in 1840 when a group of men opened a grave and found more than they expected. The different angle that emerges from the full record is how one act of political calculation combined with the honest reactions of old servants and a doctor's careful notes created a story that has outlasted the government that arranged it. The sealed nature of the tomb today keeps that story alive in a way that feels almost deliberate. It leaves us with the descriptions from the torchlight and the knowledge that we will probably never see more. That combination of what was seen and what remains hidden is what continues to pull people toward the red sarcophagus and the questions that still surround it. The men who stood in that graveyard could not have known how long their account would travel, or how many generations would still lean in to hear what they found when the last layer came away. Outro. What do you think about the state of the body and the reasons it was never examined again? Share your thoughts in the comments below.